The roots of trouble, the neighborhood, was the kind that appeared on glossy real estate brochures. Wide streets framed by neat sidewalks, identical mailboxes standing in perfect rows, and manicured lawns that gleamed in the sunlight. Everything about it was carefully curated to present the illusion of perfection. But beneath the surface, there simmered a tension that no rulebook could truly contain. At the center of this pristine community stood a house that was different not because of the siding or the shutters, but because of the massive oak tree in the front yard. Its thick branches stretched high into the sky, its roots anchored deep into the earth, and its sprawling canopy cast a protective shade over the home below. The tree was older than the subdivision itself, a survivor of decades of storms, heat waves, and construction crews that had once threatened its existence. To the homeowner, it wasn't just a tree. It was history. It was heritage. It was a symbol of resilience. But to the HOA, and more specifically, its president, a woman named Karenette, was nothing but an eyesore. Karen was the type of person who treated the HOA as her personal kingdom. Every blade of grass that grew too tall, every trash can that lingered too long on the curb, and every lawn ornament that dared to break uniformity fell under her scrutiny. Her clipboard was her sword, and her fines were arrows she shot without hesitation. The oak tree was her newest target. The first letter arrived, folded neatly in the mailbox. It carried the HOA's official letterhead, stamped with a golden seal to remind the recipient of its authority. The letter claimed that the tree's branches extended too far, that it posed a hazard, that it was non-compliant with community standards. At first, the homeowner laughed. How could anyone find fault with something so majestic? Something that had stood there long before the HOA even existed. But Karen wasn't the kind to be ignored. Weeks later, a second letter came. This time, the language was sharper, the tone more threatening. If the tree was not trimmed better yet, removed entirely, fines would be imposed, and further action would be taken. It was the kind of escalation that turned irritation into alarm. Neighbors began whispering. Some sided with the homeowner, admiring the tree's beauty and history. Others, eager to avoid conflict with Karen, nodded in agreement with her decree.
The neighborhood split into factions, divided not by fences, but by opinions about a single oak tree.
And while Karen paraded through the streets, boasting about how she would finally bring order to the block, the homeowner began researching. That's when the truth emerged. This wasn't just any tree. The oak was listed in the city's records as a protected heritage tree, one of the oldest in the county. Its age, estimated at over a century, gave it a status that no HOA rule could override. Cutting it down wasn't just unreasonable, it was illegal without explicit city approval. The discovery turned frustration into determination. The next time Karen marched down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, she didn't realize she was walking into a battle she could not win. Her authority stopped at the borders of the HOA, but the homeowner had found allies that extended far beyond. The city inspector was only a phone call away, and once he became involved, the HOA would no longer hold the upper hand. The war between the oak tree and Karen's crusade for control had officially begun, and the neighborhood would never be the same again. The inspection begins. Karen's determination to see the oak tree gone only grew stronger after her warnings were ignored. She saw the tree as defiance in physical form, a towering reminder that someone in her neighborhood dared to challenge her authority. To Karen, rules weren't guidelines, they were gospel. And anyone who disobeyed deserved punishment. She began her campaign with petty tactics. Anonymous notes were slipped into mailboxes warning neighbors of property value decline because of the unruly tree. She whispered in driveways, claiming falling branches were a danger to children, and spread rumors that roots were cracking sidewalks and damaging underground pipes. She even paraded her position at HOA meetings, painting herself as the lone defender of order against a stubborn homeowner, but her words were louder than her evidence, and cracks began to show in her crusade. While some neighbors nodded along with her rants, others exchanged doubtful looks. They had walked past that oak tree for years without issue. Children had played under its branches, and its shade had been a blessing on hot summer days. The more Karen raged, the more obvious it became that her fight was personal, not practical. The homeowner, meanwhile, was patient. The call to the city inspector had been made, and within a week, a visit was scheduled. The inspector arrived quietly. A man in a plain shirt, with a clipboard not unlike Karen's, but his authority came from law, not personal vendetta. He measured the trunk's circumference, took photographs of its branches, and consulted city records. His expression remained neutral, but his words carried weight. This tree was indeed a protected heritage tree. Karen was livid when she learned of his presence. She stormed across the lawn, demanding to know why the city was interfering in her neighborhood. The inspector listened calmly, but his response was unshakable. City ordinances superseded HOA, but the oak tree was untouchable. Any attempt to remove or damage it would result in hefty fines and possible legal action not against the homeowner, but against anyone who tried to destroy it. For a moment, it seemed the battle had been won. Neighbors breathed easier, reassured that the tree was safe under the law. The homeowner allowed a small sigh of relief, believing the inspector's word would end the madness once and for all. But Karen was not the type to retreat. Her pride was wounded, and wounded pride in a woman like her was more dangerous than any rulebook. If she couldn't wield legal authority, she would resort to pressure.
She began sending daily violation notices for other trivial infractions. Grass a half-inch too tall.
A recycling bin visible from the street, even a faded welcome mat. She patrolled the neighborhood with the intensity of a soldier on guard duty, determined to break the homeowner's resolve through harassment. The inspector's report may have saved the tree, but it hadn't ended the war. If anything, it had escalated it. Now, it was no longer about a single oak, it was about control. Karen could not accept being overruled, and her fury would ripple through the entire neighborhood. Behind closed doors, she began plotting her next move, convinced that she could outsmart the city, the homeowner, and anyone who dared stand in her way. What she didn't realize was that the more she pushed, the more attention she was drawing not just from neighbors, but from officials who were already keeping a close eye on her behavior. The roots of the tree were deep, but so too were the roots of this growing feud. And like a storm brewing on the horizon, it was only a matter of time before everything exploded into chaos. Karen declares war. Karen's obsession with the oak tree was no longer about safety, property values, or even rules. It had become personal, a battle of ego she refused to lose. The inspector's declaration had humiliated her, and humiliation was something Karen could never tolerate. In her eyes, the homeowner hadn't just defied the HOA, they had defied her. And for that, there would be consequences. She began her offensive at the next HOA board meeting. Standing before the other members, she presented a folder thick with photographs, handwritten notes, and copies of violation letters. She spoke of the homeowner's pattern of defiance, twisting minor details into exaggerated accusations. A forgotten garbage can became chronic negligence. A slightly cracked driveway became blatant disregard for community standards. And the oak tree? She labeled it a threat to neighborhood safety and stability. The board, weary of Karen's relentless tirades, nodded along at first, but behind their polite expressions, unease lingered. They had heard this song before. Karen had turned disputes into vendettas in the past, targeting neighbors over mailbox colors or seasonal decorations. Still, her position as president gave her influence, and few dared openly challenge her. Emboldened, Karen launched her next campaign. She pushed for emergency meetings, urging the board to vote on new bylaws that would indirectly target the oak tree rules about unapproved vegetation, hazardous obstructions, and mandatory uniformity of landscaping. It was a transparent maneuver, but she cloaked it in the language of safety and community well-being. The homeowner, however, was not blind to her schemes. Each time a new notice arrived, it was documented and filed. Each whispered rumor was countered with evidence. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began speaking up, tired of Karen's reign of intimidation. A silent resistance was forming, small but steady, and it was growing stronger with each of Karen's missteps. The tension boiled over one afternoon when Karen arranged for a tree service company to arrive at the property without the homeowner's consent. The crew, confused but compliant with what they thought was an official HOA order, began unloading equipment. But before they could touch a single branch, the homeowner confronted them with the inspector's written report. The words "protected heritage tree" and the threat of legal consequences stopped the workers cold. Within minutes, they packed up and left. The spectacle did not go unnoticed. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some recording the scene on their phones. Karen stood on the sidewalk, fuming, as the crew departed. Her attempt to bypass the law had backfired spectacularly, and now her actions were public. The murmurs spread quickly. She had overstepped again. But humiliation only fueled her fire. Karen doubled down, lashing out at anyone who questioned her. She scolded neighbors at block parties, posted passive-aggressive notes on community boards, and weaponized social media groups to paint herself as the victim of a selfish homeowner who endangered everyone with their rotting tree. Yet the more she ranted, the more isolated she became. Neighbors who once tolerated her now kept their distance. Even the HOA board began whispering among themselves, worried that Karen's obsession was dragging them all into legal and financial jeopardy. The oak tree stood tall through it all, unmoved by the chaos swirling around it. Its branches swayed gently in the wind, as if mocking Karen's desperate attempts to control what she could not. And while she plotted her next move, the homeowner prepared theirs on escalation that would shift the balance of power and expose Karen's reckless abuse of authority once and for all. Cracks in the crown Karen's grip on the neighborhood had always relied on fear. Fear of fines, fear of letters, fear of being the next target of her scrutiny. But fear is fragile, and once people realize it holds no real power, it crumbles like brittle glass. That was exactly what began to happen in the weeks after her failed attempt to have the oak tree removed. Word of the incident spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. Videos taken by neighbors circulated in private group chats, then leaked into community forums. The image of Karen, red-faced and shouting at a departing tree crew, became a story that everyone wanted to discuss. What she thought was a demonstration of control had transformed into a symbol of her overreach. The homeowner's quiet persistence only strengthened the divide. Every violation letter Karen sent was logged, every threat documented, every absurd claim filed neatly in a folder. When neighbors asked for proof, the homeowner shared the inspector's report, highlighting the official designation of the oak as a protected heritage tree. Piece by piece, Karen's narrative unraveled. The HOA board began to feel the pressure. Phone calls poured in from frustrated residents demanding accountability. Why were dues being spent on petty vendettas? Why was the president risking lawsuits over a tree the city itself had deemed untouchable? Some board members, once loyal to Karen, started questioning whether her leadership was more of a liability than an asset. Sensing her authority slipping, Karen escalated again. She ordered random drive-by inspections of properties, hoping to distract the neighborhood with a flurry of new violation notices. Flower pots, basketball hoops, garden hoses, nothing was too small to become the next battlefield. But instead of intimidating residents, her actions united them. One by one, neighbors began standing up, refusing to pay arbitrary fines, and demanding transparency at meetings. The tipping point came when Karen attempted to levy a massive fine against the homeowner, citing willful defiance of HOA standards. But this time, the homeowner was ready. The folder of evidence was presented not just to the HOA board, but to the city itself. Copies of every notice, photographs of the tree, and the inspector's written declaration were laid out in a meticulous timeline that revealed a pattern of harassment. The city had no patience for such behavior. Another inspector was dispatched, not to review the tree, but to review Karen's actions. The moment she saw him on the street, clipboard in hand, her stomach sank. For the first time, she realized the spotlight was no longer on the oak, it was on her. Neighbors gathered quietly as the inspector went door to door, asking questions, taking statements, and recording stories of harassment. What emerged was a damning picture. An HOA president abusing her power, targeting residents, and weaponizing fines for personal grudges. The evidence was overwhelming, and whispers of legal consequences began circulating. Karen, once untouchable, now found herself cornered. The crown she had worn so proudly as HOA president was cracking, and the roots of her downfall ran as deep as the tree she had tried so desperately to destroy. The oak stood tall as always, its branches stretching wide, casting long shadows over the street. To the homeowner, it was no longer just a tree. It was a shield, a witness, and soon it would become the symbol of Karen's undoing. The fall of the president, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted like the changing of seasons. Where once residents had bowed their heads and complied with Karen's endless demands, they now stood straighter, voices louder, confidence growing with every passing day. The oak tree had become more than just wood, and Livesit was a rallying point, a symbol of resistance against years of unchecked authority. Karen, however, refused to see the tide turning. Her world was built on control, and without it, she was nothing. She clung to her clipboard as if it were a crown, patrolling the streets with a brittle smile stretched thin across her face. Every new complaint she filed, every letter she mailed, was an act of desperation disguised as confidence, but her enemies were multiplying, and her allies were vanishing. The HOA board called a special meeting, one that Karen herself had not anticipated. For years, she had chaired every session, dictated every agenda, and silenced dissent with glares and threats of fines. But this time, she was the subject of the meeting. Residents packed the small community hall, their frustration filling the air like static before a storm. One by one, neighbors rose to speak. They described the endless harassment, the arbitrary fines, the humiliation they had endured at Karen's hands. The homeowner presented the carefully kept records, handing copies to each board member and the city inspector who sat quietly in the corner, observing every word. The evidence was undeniable. The oak tree was not just protected, it had been targeted unlawfully, and the harassment surrounding it had crossed every line of decency. Karen tried to defend herself, her voice sharp and trembling. She claimed she had acted in the neighborhood's best interest, that safety and property values demanded her vigilance. But the words rang hollow. Murmurs rose from the crowd, not of support, but of disbelief. She had overplayed her hand too many times, and now no one believed her anymore.
The board deliberated in hushed tones, but the outcome was inevitable.
A motion was raised to remove Karen as HOA president. The vote was swift. The decision, unanimous. The crown had slipped from her head, and for the first time in years, she stood powerless in the very room she once ruled. Her face flushed red as she stormed out of the hall, the echoes of whispered relief following her into the night. The community had spoken, and the verdict was clear. Her reign was over. But even as the board prepared to restructure and restore order, Karen was not finished. Pride would not allow her to accept defeat quietly. She muttered promises of appeals, threats of lawsuits, and claims of conspiracies against her. Yet the truth was undeniable. Her power was gone, stripped away not by a single person, but by the collective will of an entire neighborhood. The oak tree stood as tall as ever, casting its shade over the homeowner's property. Its roots dug deep into the soil, unmovable, untouchable, a silent witness to the downfall of the woman who had tried to erase it. But the final chapter of the battle was still to come. For Karen, humiliation had always been worse than defeat, and her next move would be driven by desperation, an act that would expose just how far she was willing to go, and how final her downfall would be. The last stand humiliation was not something Karen could accept. Being stripped of her title, losing the board's loyalty, and watching the neighborhood celebrate her downfall ignited a fire inside her. She could not stand the whispers, the sidelong glances, or the laughter that followed her down the street. To Karen, this wasn't just about an oak tree anymore. It was about her pride, her identity, her desperate need to be in control. In the weeks that followed her removal, Karen grew more erratic. She filed frivolous complaints with city offices, claiming the oak tree was diseased, dangerous, and hollow inside. Each report was dismissed after inspection, the tree confirmed as healthy and strong. She tried rallying the few neighbors still willing to listen, spinning tales of conspiracies and corruption. But where once her words inspired obedience, Now they only inspired pity. Then came the night that would define her final downfall. Under the cover of darkness, Karen returned to the tree one last time. Armed with nothing but a chainsaw borrowed in secrecy, she crept across the lawn like a thief. The roar of the engine shattered the quiet, and her plan seemed simple. If the tree was gone, then so too was the symbol of her defeat. But Karen had underestimated the neighborhood's vigilance. Lights flicked on, curtains shifted, phones were raised, cameras recording every reckless moment. The homeowner rushed outside, not in anger, but in calm certainty. They didn't have to shout. They didn't have to argue. The law was already on their side. Police arrived within minutes, summoned by multiple frantic calls. They found Karen standing at the base of the tree, her chainsaw sputtering, her fury written across her face. She ranted about rules, about respect, about how no one had listened to her. But the words no longer mattered. The officers took her statements, confiscated the chainsaw, and escorted her away, while neighbors watched silently, their judgment heavy in the air. The incident spread faster than any of Karen's past rumors. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale of an HOA president gone too far. Online forums buzzed with disbelief, strangers from across the country mocking the absurdity of her crusade. Karen had sought control, but instead, she had found infamy. In the aftermath, the HOA new leadership promised transparency, fairness, and an end to petty harassment. The homeowner, once a target, became a quiet hero to their neighbors, respected not for aggression but for resilience. And the oak tree. It remained untouched, its branches swaying gently as if celebrating its own victory. Seasons passed, and life in the neighborhood settled into peace. Children once again played beneath the tree. Couples strolled past it on evening walks, and neighbors gathered in its shade during block parties. The oak had stood for over a century, and now it stood as a monument to persistence against tyranny. Karen, stripped of power and reputation, faded from the daily rhythm of the community. Her house grew quiet, her blinds drawn, her presence no longer looming over every decision. For the neighborhood, she had become nothing more than a cautionary memory, a reminder of what happens when pride blinds a person to reason. And so the story ended not with the fall of a tree, but with the fall of a ruler who tried to cut it down. The oak still stood tall, its roots deep, its branches wide, its life a testament to endure. Long after names would be forgotten and feuds would fade, the tree would remain a silent guardian, watching, enduring, reminding all who passed beneath it that true strength is not found in control, but in resilience.